So, it's interesting how easy it is to get distracted by things. Anybody else here get distracted at all?
Not me.
I can't actually have a very in-depth conversation with my wife when I'm watching something. She'll ask me questions, and I have to stop and pause because I can't do both things at once. And this has nothing to do with multitasking, because let's be honest, the research out there tells us that nobody can actually multitask. Now, you could do one thing okay and the other one's really badly, but that doesn't mean you're doing two things at once. That's not actually what that means. And I think the reason why that is that ultimately we need focus. Human beings just need focus. It's not a question of whether or not you can do two things at once. The question is whether or not you should do two things at once. Case in point, don't drive and text. Just drive. Or stop and text. One or the other. But I mean, that's true of a lot of things, right? We lack the focus to do a lot of things at once. The reason I bring this up is that in the process, Becca and I have decided to move out of our apartment we've been in since we've been married, so 2 years. And we're deciding to go somewhere else, to live somewhere else, and we're living with friends. We're actually moving in with people we know. And what's crazy about this, and this is something you notice every time you move, I'm sure those of you who haven't moved in a long time have a hazy recollection of this. Every time you move, you realize how many things you have that you haven't used in 2 years. And that you probably aren't going to use 2 years from now, but they're essential to your life, right? You can't possibly get rid of those things. They're so important. I just don't need them. The irony of this, in my opinion, as we move things, and as I'm trying to help, we have like 6 of our friends, close friends, come over and help us move. And part of me feels guilty when I ask people to lift furniture that I don't want to lift. Let's just be honest. Because we have these things, and they're valuable things in the sense that we do use them every day. Like, you kind of need a dresser because you kind of need to wear clothes. And you kind of need to sort those clothes somewhere out of sight, right? Because you don't want your undies just sitting in a pile out in the open. Okay? That's human. This is all very human stuff. But my dresser weighs a gajillion pounds, okay? It has an attached mirror. And I'm looking at these friends, and they're younger than I am, which means they should lift things for me. It just makes sense. With all my earthly wisdom, I should be in charge of the process of having things moved for me, right? This is all meant to be a joke, but it's also true that I realized yesterday that I spent an entire day in worship, but not to God, but to all the things that make me the God of my life. Now let me unpack that a little bit before I start on this sermon. The reality of what I'm realizing in moving is that I have my own little kingdom that I transport around with me from place to place. Now some of those things are essential, right? I should wear deodorant. If I don't wear deodorant, tell me to wear deodorant, right? This is something I do because I love other people, not just because I love me, right? But there are other things in my life that are not super essential. It's valuable that at my house I have volumes that help me look into the Bible. I'm actually proud of these things. I like being able to study deeper. So I'm not super upset about my study tools, but just in case you've ever thought about this, lifting a box of books is not the most fun thing you could possibly move from place to place. But I also realized that in all of this moving, that I have to remember where I fit in the totem pole of the world, right? And typically things are one of those realities that we put a lot of value into, but don't always give us a lot of value back. And when we meet in worship, the point is to remember that part of what we are is creatures, right? Not things. We're creatures. We're created by someone else for a purpose. And we have to meet that purpose. That's that's why we gather. It's one of the reasons why we gather on a Sunday, is to recall our purpose and our place, right? Because really all giving glory to God is, which is what we're supposed to be doing right now, all giving glory to God is remembering where we fit. Remembering that we are not kings in our own private palaces. Remembering that our things don't make us kings. Even the people that are willing to help us move don't make us deities. We are creatures created to give glory to God. Because ultimately, that's when we become the best version of ourselves. Did you know that there's a study out there that says that people that feel awe, and I don't mean like looking at my baby and going, ah. I mean like looking at the sky, or looking at the ocean and feeling small, feeling like there's a greatness in the world that you're not a part of. Do you know that actually makes you a better person? They actually studied this. They took a bunch of people and they made sure that one group of people didn't feel any awe, which I'm not sure how they did that. And they had this other group of people that just went out and experienced nature, experienced beauty, experienced, the greatness of what's around them. And they literally tracked who was happier, better, kinder. And it's clearly obvious that when we feel a sense that we are not the center of the universe, we actually are better people. It's trackable. It's something that science can study. So when we come here on a Sunday, we have to recall where we fit, not because God is great, and He is, and not because we are creatures, but more than that, because that is actually where we fit. Humility is part of who we ought to be, right? Being humble is part of what makes us good. Jesus is God, and in humility became greater than just simply a God that exists. He became humble to the point of death on a cross for us, for our salvation. He had all these wonderful things, but he didn't value those things more than the creatures around him that he created, right? The reality of humility is built into our faith. Jesus had it, and so should we. And you should be reminded of that at times. Whether that's moving, or whether that's going to the ocean, or whether that's sitting here on a Sunday morning. So I welcome you into this time, which isn't just a time to listen to me drone on about some part or piece of faith, but to remember where we are, and that we're creatures built for a larger purpose than shuffling things from one place to another, than decorating ourselves to go out from one place to another. We are more than that, and yet humble enough to remember where we fit. And so I invite you into this morning's study. We're going to be going through the teachings of Jesus in Matthew, and we'll spend quite a bit of time in what they call the Sermon on the Mount, which is from 5 to 7. And today I wanted to kind of dive into some of that, but I want you all to think as we get there that this time isn't just a time to think deeply, but it's a time to feel deeply the glory and splendor and immenseness of God that not only could create all things, but could step into that creation and feel pain on our behalf. And so before I pray, I'm just going to be quiet for a second, and then I will pray, and we will start our time in the Word. Lord God, creator of the universe, we come before you, not just in a specific place, but in our minds, in our hearts, in our souls. We take a step back. We take a step down to remember where we fit. And to take this time to offer up to you what you deserve, which is honor and glory for everything that you do, both the amazing absolutely astounding concept that you would step here, that you would live and breathe and feel on our behalf. Help us to be creatures that were called, that give glory where glory is due, and live lives that are honoring not just to ourselves, but to you. In all these things, Lord, we ask that you would be with us, guide us in our learning and our growth this morning, and send us out to learn and grow more, to follow you better. In the name of your Son, Jesus, we pray. By the power of the Holy Spirit, we all say, Amen. Matthew chapter 5, verses 13 through 16 say this. And these are the words of Jesus. You are the salt of the earth. But if salt has lost its taste, how can its saltiness be restored? It is no longer good for anything, but is thrown out and trampled underfoot. You are the light of the world. A city built on a hill cannot be hid. No one, after lighting a lamp, puts it under the bushel basket, but on a lampstand, and it gives light to all the house. In the same way, let your light shine before others, so that they may see your good works and give glory to your Father in heaven. So I somewhat introduced this idea, right? That who we are is light givers, that who we are is salt. So this morning, I tried to introduce this concept in our youth time. And it's kind of hard to really talk about some of these things, because first of all, salt doesn't typically actually lose its saltiness, except in a couple of cases. And I was kind of lucky. In the youth room back there, there's a salt shaker. It's kind of one of those fancy ones, that sort of has like flat sides, and it has a sort of like teardrop top. It looks really pretty, right? And in it is this white salt, all the way to the top. And I took it out and I handed it to one of the youth in our group, and I said, okay, what is this? Kind of a dumb question, right? Well, it's salt. Dirt. Okay, what is salt used for? Well, it's flavor. I said, yeah, it's a flavor. And then I kind of got into the deeper question. So who here's ever had popcorn with no butter, no salt, no caramel, no cheese? Anybody? What does that kind of popcorn taste like? Squeezy fluff that gets stuck in your teeth. That's about it, okay? There's really nothing to it. It's just squeezy fluff, and the kernels get stuck in your teeth, and you think to yourself, why did I even bother? No flavor, and I have to floss. Why would I do that to myself? What is the purpose of popcorn without salt or butter, or as my niece says, without kettle? Yeah, because kettle corn is yummy. Regular popcorn is just nothing, right? There's nothing to it. We know the purpose of salt, right? It's not surprising. When you use it, it has value. It can make, it can make potatoes a meal, right? Not to say that I don't love potatoes, but most of the time potatoes are, they're somewhat bland. That's the word we use to describe things without flavor. They're bland. And so we add flavor to them. And we can get more crazy. We can add cumin, we can add rosemary. There's a ton of seasonings out there. But a seasoning that doesn't season is completely useless, right? It doesn't matter what kind of seasoning it is. If it doesn't actually achieve its task, it has no purpose. It's just granules of nothing. I mean, the dirt is made of granules of nothing. And that's what he's saying. It's like dirt. It has no purpose. And likewise, what's the point of having lights if we never turn them on? You're not achieving the goal, which is to be able to see, to be able to notice things, right? Because if this room were completely dark, and I mean no sunlight from the outside, nothing, then this would be a weird gathering, right? Wouldn't it be odd to sit in a dark room and listen to a guy talk? It would be weird. Okay? Light is valuable for a lot of reasons. Now, I heard this explained in an interesting way recently, and I think it's a good explanation. It's not the only explanation. So, I don't know if any of you are familiar with this breakdown. Are any of you familiar there are other types of Christians apart from the type we are? I'm okay with some of you yelling at other types of Christians. What are other types of Christians?
Catholics.
Catholics, absolutely. It's another type of Christian. One of the oldest types of Christian. What's another type of Christian?
Mormon Baptists.
Mormons. That one's one that people debate, but they do serve and they do glorify Jesus, so you walk a line there. What's another type of Christian?
Baptists.
Methodists, absolutely. There's all sorts of stuff going on with Methodists these days. They're even in the news. What's another type of Christian? Jehovah's Witness. Another type of Christian. Seventh-day Adventists. Yeah. Now there's disagreements among these groups. That's why we're different types of Christians, right? That's why that exists. You know, one of the big ones, at least in my opinion, one of the big and most interesting things that separates some types of Christians from other types is the way they understand being salt and light. For instance, there are types of Christians, and there's multiple ones, that believe that the way to serve Christ is to get out in the world and do things that are commonly called social justice. Now, social justice means that you feed the hungry, you visit the people in prison, that you walk with people who are experiencing life in difficult ways. This is what they call social justice. And not only do you attempt to be there, but you attempt to change things, right? You try to make things right. So you change systems that are broken into systems that function. You try and work to make sure that prisons actually imprison people who are breaking the law, and not just all people. You work for all sorts of things. This is one type of way of doing salt and light. Now, another way of doing salt and light is what another subset of Christians do, and that is to make sure that people know about Jesus, right? It's what we call evangelism. So you bring light into people's lives by telling people about Christ, what he did, how he lived, how he saved. And we know what's weird about this? That they each think they're completely right and the other side is completely wrong. Now you can make a pretty good biblical case for both things, right? That one way that you can be salt is by changing the world's flavor. And the one way you can be light is by bringing Christ into it as a mirror, a reflection of the fact that Jesus is the light of the world. You know what's weird about this argument? Is I think it actually doesn't serve God at all. When one part of his church says, well, no, we just tell people about Jesus, and the other side goes, no, we get out there and we try to change the world, but we don't force Jesus on people, because that would be inconsiderate. You know what's funny about that argument? It's stupid. And yet we fight this thing out all the time. And I'm not saying that I think we should be more like one than the other. I'm thinking we should probably do both, right? Help each other to achieve both ends of this.
Amen.
Tell people about Christ, but maybe be Christ to somebody else. Step into a horrible situation and say, you know what, I don't know how to help you, but I do know I should try. Because both things are very, very important.
Yes.
And that argument is just silly. Now what Jesus is doing here, when he talks about salt and then he talks about light, this is something you see in the Psalms all the time. There's a fancy phrase for it. It's called parallelism. It means you basically draw a line, and then you draw a line right next to it that's the same thing, right? Be salt, because something that isn't salty isn't very useful. Be light, because if you hide light, why even bother having light, right? These are parallel concepts. And yet at the same time, they're different ideas. Light is not salt, salt is not light. Which means that there is several different ways to achieve the same thing. Be salt, be light. These are achievable things. Now, we can't be salt without the creator of salt, and we can't be light without light. Meaning, we don't serve other people on our own. We don't give people freedom and right treatment and good judgments on our own. We do those things as a reflection of Christ who existed before us and will exist forever. As Christians, we are, weirdly enough, Christ ones. We are the ones like Christ. It's really that simple. And when we are like Christ, well, we have light and we have flavor. And without Christ, we have no flavor and no light. I spent a lot of time explaining something that's pretty self-explanatory, right? But I think we have to be careful how we interpret things, because you can interpret things two different ways, and both of those interpretations can be correct. Yes? Now, I think most of us would agree there are ways to interpret things that are incorrect. So don't misunderstand me. I think in this particular case, being salt and light is what God is calling us to do. Let's be salt and light. If we see something unjust, let's attempt to right it. When we see somebody who needs Jesus, let's attempt to introduce them. Right? I think that's a funny way to put it, because I've always been really bad at introducing people. By which I mean, Becca and I go to a party, and I know most of the people there, and Becca does not know most of the people there. I'm horrible at saying, oh, hi, this is my wife, Becca. Becca, this is Crystal. Crystal, Becca, Becca, Crystal. And even just saying it sounds silly, but Becca, Crystal, Becca. Like, it's stupid, right? Why am I introducing them? They will figure it out. That's not actually how it works. We introduce people all the time. And we should. We should introduce people to Jesus. He's worth knowing. Right? We wouldn't be here if we didn't think so. I hope. So both things are valuable. Let's introduce people to Christ, and let's make sure that they live in a world where Jesus can be seen. Right? It's hard to see Jesus when you're hungry. It's hard to see Jesus when you're in prison. It's hard to see Jesus when things are wrong, because he starts to disappear. He starts to get lost in all the other stuff we put around. I'm going to add another one to this, and this one's the harder one, right? I think salt and light is fairly self-explanatory. I still gave you several minutes of it. Here's the one that I think is hard, but I'm going to try to boil this down. The next section says, do you think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets? I have come not to abolish, but to fulfill. For truly I tell you, until heaven and earth pass away, not one letter, not one stroke of a letter, or as it says in some versions, not one jot or tittle, not one mark upon your page, will pass from the law until all is accomplished. Therefore, whoever breaks one of the least of these commandments and teaches others to do the same will be called the least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever does them and teaches them will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. For I tell you, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and the Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of the heavens. I talked a little about this last week, that the idea of the kingdom of the heavens is that place that we don't go. And I don't mean heaven as in when we die. I mean that God exists outside of our power, right? He created the universe, and he resides here, around, in, about. But if you think about it, God exists outside of time. We do not. We exist in time. God exists in a place, or in a reality that we do not. Okay? Our bodies, our souls, whoever we are, aren't there. The kingdom of the heavens is God's justice, his peace, his glory, his love, shining into our world. That's the kingdom of the heavens. We don't exist there, but God does. But it can come into our world, for the kingdom of heavens is coming near. Right? That's the idea. Now, to shine some light on what he just said, does anybody know how many laws there are in the Old Testament? Because that's what Jesus is talking about. How many laws are there? There's an exact number. Does anybody know what it is? 613. There are 613 jots and tittles in the Old Testament. Okay? Now, just to give you some concept, the Pharisees and the scribes memorized them. And I don't mean like they kind of sort of knew them, but they actually knew every single one by heart in the original language, in Hebrew. And they could recite them at a moment's notice. Anybody else here can recite all 613 of the Old Testament laws? I'm going to guess not. Okay? So do you think you could match up to that? Who here could be better than the scribes and the Pharisees at memorizing and knowing the law? Yeah, not anybody in this room. I know a lot of the Bible, and I can't tell you more than 25. I tried this morning, that's why I know. I know the original 10, right? And I know a few extras on top of that. I know that I'm not supposed to wear clothing that has 2 different types of cloth. Failed today. So what's he saying? Is he saying we have to wear clothes that are just made out of 100% cotton? That's how most Christians look at it, right? Because we believe that there's something more being said here. But the problem with it is that oftentimes if we're willing to interpret what Jesus is saying here as being metaphorical, then that means we can kind of discount what he's saying in the Sermon on the Mount. How about we interpret it through a different scripture? That's how I like to do it. I like to gather from other places and see if maybe that will shine some light on it. Jeremiah 31 through 34 says this. The days are surely coming, says Yahweh, when I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and the house of Judah. It will not be like the covenant that I made with their ancestors when I took them by the hand to bring them out of the land of Egypt. A covenant that they broke, though I was their husband, says Yahweh. But this is the covenant that I will make with the house of Israel after those days, the days that you're in exile, says Yahweh. I will put my law within them, and I will write it on their hearts, and I will be their God, and they shall be my people. No longer shall they teach one another or say to each other, know Yahweh, for they shall all know me. From the least of them to the greatest, says Yahweh. For I will forgive their iniquity and remember their sin no more. So back to those 613. There are laws in the Old Testament that are all about how we give sacrifices. Who here has given a good sacrifice of a goat to Yahweh recently? Anybody? Anybody? Whew. Not looking good, folks. Not looking good. There are some laws in the Old Testament that are about how we treat our neighbor and how we deal with situations that are kind of sticky. Anybody here killed anybody else's goat recently and then made sure they paid back with an extra goat? Come on, people. You didn't pay anybody back for their lost goat? Not looking good. Not looking good. Anybody here have a plot of land that they, cultivate plants in? Anybody? Okay, there's some planters here. Have any of you made sure that on the 7th year you don't plant in that plot, but you leave it lie fallow? Anybody doing that? You haven't had that plot of land for 7 years. Okay, you're off the hook. Anybody else? Planting every year? Not looking good. Not looking good. Not looking good. Anybody here have any issues with stealing? Oh, we're looking better there. Okay, good. There are laws for all sorts of different things in that 613. There's lots of them. Lots and lots. Now, most Christians assume that some of those ones about, different types of clothing and plots of land have kind of slid out of the thing. And since we don't all own goats, we don't always have to pay back an extra goat or 4 sheep or 2 cows. It's a really complicated law. The problem we have with reading the Old Testament is that we sort of pick and choose based on what we kind of want. We do the same thing with the Sermon on the Mount, by the way. Some of those things are really hard to do, so we kind of I'll do that tomorrow. What's the problem with that interpretation? Anybody have a guess? It's incomplete. Okay? So Jesus came and he does something to some of those laws. Those ones about sacrifice. How does Jesus take care of those? He becomes the sacrifice. So Jesus deals with all of our issues having to do with sin and mistreatment by taking that on himself. So some of those he just covers over with his own blood. And as it says in Jeremiah, we don't have to worry about those because he fulfills them. Okay? Now what about the way we treat our neighbors? Is there something in the New Testament about treating our neighbors? How does that go? Love your neighbor as you love yourself. If we can love our neighbors as we love ourselves, then we can take care of a lot of those how do we deal with I killed somebody else's goat thing. We just add, how do I deal with having run into somebody else's car? Right? Do we do that honorably and right? None of these laws have gone away. What's changed is our hearts. If you follow Jesus, I'm hoping there's a nudge and a pull and a tug on you when you do something that isn't very nice. The one I struggle with, and Becca probably a little bit too, is the way we talk to people when we're driving our vehicles. I'm pretty sure I'm not supposed to say those things to other people when I'm driving my car. But I lose it, right? I lose that sense of who Christ is calling me to be because I have somewhere to be. What am I really doing? I'm making my time an idol, folks. That's one of the big ones, right? Don't create any idols. Do you know that we do that all the time? I basically just spent an entire day in service to my idols, moving them from place A to place B. I know my idols. I cleaned them, I polished them, I packaged them, and I carried them, heavy as they are, from place 1 to place 2. And those are just my physical idols, my time, my thoughts, my peace. All these things I spend a lot of time thinking about and placing in front of God. If things are written on our hearts, which is what Jeremiah tells us this new covenant is going to be about, then we probably should be saltier. We probably should be radiant. There should be something different about us in this world if we truly believe that the creator of the universe stepped into our mess and cleaned it up for us and taught us how to live it. The unfortunate thing is, I'm not going to start with any of you. I'm going to start with me. I don't live up to that nearly as often as I ought. I'm not nearly as yummy as I ought to be, and I don't put off nearly as much light as I should. But I'm convicted that when I read something like this, that what should be imprinted upon my heart is Jesus. If Jesus is imprinted upon my heart, then who I am slowly begins to change, becomes brighter, becomes more flavorful. It becomes something worth having. Because in the end, all those things I moved, they're not going with me. It won't matter what type of clothes I wear because I won't be wearing any. And I'm not just saying this because at some point we go away from earth. I'm saying this because who we are on earth matters. I'm always confused about people who put heaven in front of earth. I love those songs where it's like, this is not my home. Then why are you here? Why did God put you here in the first place if this is not your home? Sorry folks, it's your home. You're here. And I'm guessing that in your own houses, you don't, hoping this is true, you don't go to the bathroom on the floor. You keep it clean, right? I'm going to guess that you don't do horrible things in that space because you have to live there. That's true of the earth, too. One of the laws in the Old Testament has to do with the way we treat the earth, like this one about planting and leaving it fallow every 7th year. That's how we care for the planet God created and gave to us to live on. And we're not very good at that either. And I don't want to go into politics about this, but the reality is, if we have to legislate how we treat the planet, it's probably because we're not salt and light. Because it's our job to take care of the earth. We're not just its kings, we're its caretakers. Adam and Eve were put on earth to care for the land, not mess it up. And so at some point, some of these things are not imprinted upon our hearts, but if we keep stepping further into Christ, the hope is they will, right? They will become saltier. It will become lighter. And at the end of this, I don't think it should ever be about guilt. Because here's the thing. Fear and guilt can make us do things, but not for the right reason, right? Jesus developed these relationships with these disciples, the people he's teaching here. Relationships that spanned years, that included meals, that included walking together, that included working together and stinking together, right? Not to throw a wrench into this whole thing, but I'm pretty sure Jesus had body odor as well. He was human, right? Doesn't mean he was a sinner. It just means that when you do things with other people, you do life, right? Discipleship, this thing that Jesus is doing in the Sermon on the Mount, teaching his disciples, the mentor-mentee relationship, is about walking with one another. We are a community of faith, right? Which means we have to look differently. We ought to be salt and light, but we also ought to be able to teach one another these differences. Replicate it. Or as we often say, we make disciples, make disciples, make disciples, make disciples, and so on and so on. Jesus started a process that we keep going. Where those 613 laws are imprinted upon our hearts. They change who we are, how we taste, how we look. So today, my thoughts and encouragement to you are that don't make this a law like the Pharisees did. I mean, I wouldn't mind if you memorized the Sermon on the Mount. It's not super long, but it's got some good stuff in it. But I'd rather you had it imprinted upon your hearts. I'd rather you looked at it as a way of being, not just a way of thinking. Because I think that's what Jesus meant. Not who do you want to be, not who do you think you should be, but who can I make you be? Who can I change you into? How can I transform you today to be more like Jesus? Like me, as Jesus would say. So today I lift this up to you for deeper thought, but I also think if you could find one place in your life that you could be a little brighter, a little saltier, it's always a good first step. Finding one place where you might be able to make the world better by your very existence in it. Because remember, we were just given charge of the planet, not rulership of it. We're caretakers. Caretakers. We have these things written upon our hearts. Will you pray with me? Lord God, we ask that this morning that we could be branded with your love upon our souls, upon the innermost part of us, that you could be in the very center of us, in our guts, teaching us and growing us to be more like you, to be caretakers of this world, to be caretakers of one another, and not to put anything above those that we should love. For in the end, we cannot love things, and things cannot love us. But if we are loved by you, then we must love you and others, reflecting who you are, and our salt and our light. Help us, Father, to do that better today than yesterday, because every day is an opportunity to be salt and to be light, to shine for you. All this we pray in the name of your Son, Jesus, and by the power of the Holy Spirit.